The dust wasn't just on the fields, it was in every home, in every breath. By 1933, a third of American banks had failed, factories stood silent, and millions of families were teetering on the edge of despair. But amidst the ruins of prosperity, stories of resilience, desperation, and unexpected heroism were quietly shaping the soul of a nation. This is the story of that era, a story of hardship so vast, it shook the very foundations of the United States, yet gave rise to courage, ingenuity, and hope where it was least expected. The morning sky over Omaha was a pale gray, the kind that seemed to swallow the sun before it could rise. John Thompson, a 32-year-old father of two, sat on the wooden steps of his small rented farmhouse, watching the wind sweep the fields bare. His family's farm, once prosperous, with rows of golden wheat and corn, had become a patchwork of dry, cracked earth. The prices had plummeted, debts had mounted, and last week the bank had foreclosed. Now he had nothing but memories and the stubborn hope that somehow they would survive. Across the Midwest, the story was the same. The 1920s had promised endless prosperity. Cities gleamed with new buildings, cars filled streets, and radios brought jazz into every living room. But beneath the shimmer, the foundations were shaky. Overproduction in agriculture and industry, speculative investments, and uneven wealth distribution created a fragile economy. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, it was not merely numbers on a ticker. It was the collapse of dreams, savings, and lives. In New York, on Wall Street, the panic was instantaneous. Brokers screamed into telephones, trying to sell stocks that nobody wanted. By the end of Black Tuesday, October 29th, the market had lost nearly $30 billion, more than the US government's annual budget at the time. Families who had invested their life savings were destitute overnight. Banks that had lent money freely now closed their doors. John Thompson didn't understand the intricacies of finance, but he knew one thing: the money his father had saved, the land he hoped to pass to his children, the very future of his family, was gone. In cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit, unemployment skyrocketed. By 1932, nearly 25% of the workforce had no jobs. Men stood in bread lines, clutching numbered tickets as if they were lifelines. Women sewed scraps into quilts or sold baked goods on corners. Children went hungry, schools closed for lack of funding, and families were forced into shanty towns, mockingly called Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the crisis. These makeshift communities, built from scrap wood and tin, dotted city outskirts, a stark monument to human survival amid government failure. The human toll was devastating. The Dust Bowl, a series of severe droughts in the Great Plains, compounded the misery. Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Nebraska saw millions of acres of farmland reduced to dust. Crops failed, livestock died, and the wind carried topsoil across state lines, turning the sky brown. Families like the Thompsons were forced to migrate westward, joining the throngs of Okies seeking work in California. Some found temporary jobs picking fruit or building roads. Most found only rejection and despair. In California, towns swelled with migrants. Workers slept in cars, tents, and under bridges. Children wandered dusty streets searching for scraps of food. Yet amidst this desperation, remarkable acts of solidarity emerged. Communities shared what little they had. Soup kitchens run by volunteers or churches offered hot meals to hundreds daily. The federal government, slowly awakening to the crisis, began programs under the New Deal, initiated by Franklin Roosevelt after his 1932 election. Roosevelt's promise of a New Deal for the American people was not just rhetoric.
Agencies like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, the Public Works Administration, PWA, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, provided work, income, and hope. Young men were sent to plant trees, build dams, and restore forests. Roads were paved, schools constructed, and electricity reached rural communities for the first time. John Thompson, after months of wandering, found employment with the CCC, planting trees in Missouri. It wasn't a life of wealth or comfort, but it was a life with dignity, with purpose, and with the chance to see his children fed. Meanwhile, culture itself transformed under the weight of the Depression. Literature, music, and cinema reflected the hardships of ordinary people. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath would later immortalize the plight of Dust Bowl migrants, while folk songs like Woody Guthrie's ballads carried the sorrow and resilience of the working class across the nation. Movies provided an escape, offering audiences a brief respite from hunger and fear. Yet beyond escapism, art documented the era. Photographers like Dorothea Lange captured haunting images of poverty, despair, and unbroken human spirit. Her photograph, Migrant Mother, became the symbol of the Depression's suffering and resilience. The Depression did more than empty pockets. It reshaped American society. Labor movements gained momentum. Strikes, once sporadic, became national news as workers demanded fair wages, safe conditions, and recognition of unions. The 1934 West Coast longshore strike, for instance, involved tens of thousands of dock workers in San Francisco, highlighting the tension between desperate workers and entrenched industrial powers. African American communities, already facing systemic discrimination, were hit hardest. Job scarcity intensified racial tensions, but also sparked the emergence of activist movements and leaders who would later shape civil rights campaigns. By 1937, the economy had improved, yet the scars remained. Families who survived had endured years of uncertainty, loss, and unimaginable hardship. Many had lost land, loved ones, or lifelong dreams. Yet the experience forged resilience. Americans learned to stretch every dollar, rely on community networks, and innovate in ways previously unimagined. Programs initiated during this period laid the groundwork for modern social safety nets, shaping the nation's identity in profound ways. For John Thompson, the story of survival was also the story of family. He returned to Omaha after years of wandering, having saved enough to reclaim a small plot of land. His children, now older, remembered only fragments of the worst years, but they carried forward lessons of perseverance, resourcefulness, and empathy. The Thompsons were ordinary people who had weathered an extraordinary storm, just as millions of others had. By 1934, the Depression had reshaped even the cities that once symbolized wealth and opportunity. In New York City, skyscrapers towered over slums where families struggled to survive on meager wages or charity. The Bowery, once a bustling district of cheap lodging and entertainment, had become a refuge for the homeless. Men slept in alleyways, wrapped in newspapers or rags, while the municipal soup kitchens served thousands daily. It was here that John Thompson's cousin, Samuel, found himself wandering after losing his job in a Brooklyn shipyard. Samuel, once proud and self-sufficient, now depended on strangers' kindness for every meal.
The plight of children was particularly severe. Many schools had to close due to lack of funding, and those that remained open struggled to provide even the bare necessities. Children who should have been in classrooms were instead scavenging for food or working in factories and farms to help their families survive. The National Child Labor Committee reported that the number of children under 16 working in the United States increased dramatically during the Depression. Despite this, many found small joys in simple games, street performances, or storytelling, a testament to human resilience in the harshest conditions. Meanwhile, in the South, African American communities faced compounded hardships. Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation and discrimination, and the economic downturn intensified inequality. Many black farmers lost their land when banks foreclosed, and sharecroppers faced eviction. Yet, amidst adversity, leaders like Mary McLeod Bethune emerged, advocating for education, civil rights, and access to New Deal programs for African Americans. Churches became centers of support, offering meals, shelter, and moral guidance. In these communities, survival required both ingenuity and solidarity. In the industrial heartlands of Detroit and Chicago told another story. Factories that had thrived during World War I and the Roaring Twenties now stood silent. Assembly lines were abandoned, and the roar of machinery gave way to the haunting quiet of unemployment. Strikes and labor disputes became common as desperate workers demanded fair wages. In Flint, Michigan, auto workers endured months without pay, organizing sit-ins and protests that would eventually inspire future labor rights movements. For men like George Simmons, a former auto worker, every day was a battle against despair. His wife Clara turned to sewing and taking in laundry, doing everything to keep the family afloat. The Dust Bowl, however, remained one of the most striking environmental and economic disasters of the era. Families like the Thompsons were not alone in fleeing westward. Thousands of migrants from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas traveled along Route 66, hoping to find work in California's agricultural fields. They carried what little they could, old clothes, meager savings, and fragile hopes. Yet the reality they faced was brutal. Farm work was scarce, wages were low, and hostility from local residents was common. Many were forced into camps provided by the federal government or the state, which, though modest, offered shelter and sustenance. Amid this turmoil, Roosevelt's New Deal sought to stabilize and reform the economy. The Civilian Conservation Corps provided jobs for young men in conservation projects. The Public Works Administration, PWA, funded infrastructure projects from schools to highways. The Social Security Act of 1935 introduced the first federal safety nets for the elderly, disabled, and unemployed. These programs didn't end the Depression overnight, but they offered a lifeline, and they instilled hope that the government would act to protect ordinary citizens from total ruin. In cities, New Deal programs changed the urban landscape as well. Workers were employed to construct parks, bridges, and public buildings. Public murals celebrated labor and culture, funded by the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. Artists, writers, and musicians were employed to document American life, ensuring that the struggles and triumphs of ordinary people were preserved for posterity. The Federal Theater Project staged productions that reflected the hardships of the time, bringing stories of survival and hope to audiences who desperately needed both. For families, survival often required ingenuity. Women like Clara Simmons became the backbone of households, managing scarce resources, growing vegetables in backyard gardens, and stretching every penny.
Recipes were adapted, clothing mended or repurposed, and household labor shared among children. Community networks grew stronger as neighbors helped one another find work, food, and shelter. It was a period that demanded creativity, resilience, and unwavering determination. Meanwhile, the Depression exposed the fragility of American financial systems. Thousands of banks had failed, wiping out savings for millions. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 sought to reform banking, separating commercial and investment banking and introducing federal insurance for deposits. The Securities Act and Securities Exchange Act aimed to regulate the stock market and restore public confidence. These measures, while technical, had profound human consequences, ensuring that families like the Thompsons would never again lose everything overnight due to speculative financial practices. Culturally, the Depression also sparked a flowering of creativity. John Steinbeck, through The Grapes of Wrath, chronicled the migration and suffering of Dust Bowl families, capturing the human dimension of economic collapse. Photographers like Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans documented the faces and landscapes of poverty, creating images that remain iconic symbols of the era. Music evolved too, with folk, blues, and jazz expressing the sorrow, resilience, and hope of everyday Americans. Radio broadcasts provided news, entertainment, and a sense of connection in a fragmented nation. Yet, amidst despair, stories of heroism emerged. Ordinary Americans performed extraordinary acts of kindness. Soup kitchens fed hundreds daily, often run by volunteers who had as little as those they helped. Teachers opened classrooms for community use. Clergy provided shelter, and neighbors shared food and fuel. These acts, small in isolation but vast in aggregate, forged a sense of community that would endure long after the Depression ended. By the late 1930s, signs of recovery began to appear, although the shadow of unemployment remained. Programs like the Social Security Act, labor protections, and federal investment in infrastructure reshaped the economic and social landscape. Families began to rebuild, farmers returned to their fields, and cities slowly regained vitality. The war in Europe and eventually America's entry into World War II would ultimately stimulate full economic recovery. But the lessons of the Depression, the importance of government intervention, social safety nets, and community resilience remained indelibly etched in the national consciousness. John Thompson, returning to Omaha with his children, reflected on the years of suffering and struggle. They had endured loss, hunger, and uncertainty, but they had survived. His children, now older, carried forward the lessons of perseverance, resourcefulness, and empathy. They remembered stories of the CCC, of migrants on Route 66, of men and women who refused to give up despite overwhelming odds. The Thompsons' journey mirrored that of millions of Americans, ordinary people who weathered an extraordinary storm, shaping the character of a nation through endurance, courage, and hope. The Great Depression was more than an economic catastrophe. It was a crucible of human resilience. It exposed the weaknesses of financial and social systems, demanded ingenuity and solidarity from ordinary citizens, and forged policies and cultural shifts that would define America for decades. From the Dust Bowl plains to the urban centers of New York and Chicago, from migrant camps in California to New Deal projects across the nation, the era left a legacy of hardship, learning, and inspiration.
It is a story of despair and hope, of failure and triumph, and above all, of the human spirit's capacity to endure. Every family that struggled, every worker who protested, every volunteer who served in a soup kitchen contributed to a collective narrative of survival that remains a cornerstone of American history. The Great Depression reminds us that even in the darkest times, resilience, solidarity, and hope can light the way forward, a lesson as vital today as it was nearly a century ago. In Appalachia, the story of the Depression unfolded in the coal fields. Towns like Harlan County, Kentucky, had relied on coal mining for decades. When demand fell, miners were laid off, and company towns became hollowed-out shells. Families lived in patch towns, small clusters of company-owned houses, often with no indoor plumbing or electricity. Food was scarce. Children went to school hungry or not at all. The coal companies controlled nearly every aspect of life,
housing, stores, even the local doctor, making resistance risky. Yet miners organized strikes, demanding fair wages and safer working conditions. Women played pivotal roles in these struggles, running households under extreme scarcity while secretly supporting union activities. These communities exemplified the harshest realities of economic collapse in rural America, where survival demanded both grit and solidarity. In Florida, citrus workers faced a different type of struggle. Oranges and grapefruit, once lucrative crops, became a gamble in a depressed economy. Prices plummeted, and migrant laborers often went unpaid or underpaid. Families traveled from grove to grove, following the seasonal harvests. Disease and poor living conditions were common, with shanties and overcrowded camps housing entire families. Yet these workers persisted, their labor feeding millions of Americans, even as their own children went hungry. Local activists and New Deal agencies tried to improve conditions, but progress was slow, and inequities remained stark. Meanwhile, in Texas oil towns, the boom and bust cycle intensified hardship. Oil production, once a symbol of prosperity, became oversaturated, driving prices down and bankrupting independent operators. Small towns emptied as workers migrated in search of new opportunities, while those left behind relied on makeshift barter systems to survive. Families adapted by raising livestock, planting gardens, and sharing scarce resources with neighbors. These communities learned early lessons about resilience in the face of market instability, lessons that would later inform agricultural and labor policy reforms. Across the nation, children bore an enormous burden. In Chicago, New York, and Detroit, children sold newspapers, shined shoes, or ran errands to help support their families. Many suffered from malnutrition, and schools struggled to accommodate their needs. In rural areas, children worked on farms from dawn to dusk, often missing school entirely. Yet amidst these hardships, they found joy in small pleasures, improvised games, stories passed down from parents, or singing together to lift spirits. Children of the Depression grew up faster than their predecessors, shaped by scarcity, uncertainty, and the necessity of responsibility. New Deal programs touched nearly every corner of American life. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, transformed the Tennessee River Valley, providing hydroelectric power to regions that had never known electricity. Dams, bridges, and irrigation projects created jobs and modernized rural communities. Families experienced a standard of living previously unimaginable: electric lights, running water, and opportunities for education and industry. Similarly, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, employed thousands of artists, musicians, and writers. Federal Writers Project teams documented oral histories from ordinary Americans, capturing first-hand accounts of hardship, resilience, and hope.
These projects ensured that the stories of everyday citizens were not lost to history. In the Midwest, dust storms continued to ravage the land. Families traveled west along Route 66 in search of employment, often confronting prejudice and hostility. Migrants were called Okies and Arkies, labels loaded with stigma, yet many pressed on, driven by desperation and hope. Camps established by the Farm Security Administration offered temporary relief, providing modest shelter, clean water, and medical care. These camps became lifelines for families otherwise abandoned by an indifferent economy. The cultural impact of the Depression cannot be overstated. Music evolved as a medium for both protest and solace. Woody Guthrie songs, full of empathy for the dispossessed, became anthems for migrants and laborers. Jazz, blues, and folk provided entertainment and comfort, reflecting the pain and resilience of a generation. Literature documented the human experience, from Steinbeck's narratives of Dust Bowl migrants to James T. Farrell's depictions of Chicago's urban poor. Photography, led by the likes of Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans, captured iconic images that remain etched in the national memory. Faces lined with worry, eyes full of determination, and children clinging to hope. Women, too, were central to survival during this era. They managed households under extreme scarcity, often taking in laundry, sewing for neighbors, or selling homegrown produce. Women in cities organized relief efforts, while rural women maintained gardens, preserved food, and supported extended families. Their labor, largely invisible, was critical to sustaining communities and ensuring the survival of the next generation. John Thompson, reflecting on his family's journey, saw both tragedy and triumph. They had lost land, savings, and security, yet they had survived. Their children carried forward the lessons of perseverance, ingenuity, and empathy. The nation, too, had changed. Financial regulations, social safety nets, and cultural expressions of resilience became enduring legacies. The Great Depression was not merely an economic collapse. It was a defining moment in the American story, a crucible that tested the limits of endurance and the depths of compassion.
The stories of ordinary Americans, farmers, laborers, women, and children paint a portrait of survival against overwhelming odds. Soup kitchens, migrant camps, New Deal projects, and community solidarity were lifelines that kept the nation afloat. Artists, writers, and musicians documented the era, ensuring that the lessons, struggles, and triumphs were remembered. The resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for adaptation, and the power of hope were revealed in every act of survival, every small victory, and every expression of empathy. The Great Depression left a legacy that continues to inform American society. Social safety nets, labor protections, and financial regulations were born out of necessity. Communities learned to rely on one another, creating bonds that endured beyond the crisis. The era demonstrated the fragility of prosperity and the necessity of government intervention during extreme hardship. Most importantly, it revealed that even in the darkest times, courage, ingenuity, and hope could illuminate a path forward. From the plains of Oklahoma to the coal fields of Kentucky, from the migrant camps of California to the cities of the East Coast, the Great Depression shaped the lives of millions. It was a period of unimaginable hardship, yet it was also a time of remarkable human resilience. Families endured, communities organized, and the nation learned invaluable lessons about solidarity, justice, and the necessity of support for the most vulnerable. As John Thompson watched his children play in the fields once again, he understood that the future was fragile but full of possibility. The storms of the past had left scars, but they had also forged strength, character, and an unshakable understanding of what it meant to endure. The story of the Great Depression is, at its heart, the story of America, its struggles, its innovations, its failures, and its enduring hope. And in the end, that hope carried the nation forward, ensuring that no matter how deep the darkness, the American spirit could find light, rebuild, and rise anew.